So there's this guy talking to her.
About 3, 4 in the morning, you'll see them out here.
A lot of the people here, they struggle with many different things.
You'll see older men just sitting in cars idling.
Nobody wants to be out here doing what they have to do.
Come here. How you doing?
Words of comfort and support. They echo most nights on the streets of Winnipeg.
Did you sleep yesterday?
Yeah.
Debbie Cumby is a community outreach worker.
Be safe. We'll see you later.
You want to ride home or anything? No? You okay? You need anything else?
Kurt Chapko is a police detective, part of an elite unit trying to counter sexual exploitation and human trafficking.
This is our regular route. We drive in this area and the other areas that have high levels of exploitation.
They are both leading a transformation, a new way to fight human trafficking. The approach, firmly focused on victims, and most of the ones they meet here come from Canada's minority Indigenous community.
Okay, 2 females on the south side of Notre Dame. They're walking westbound. They're going to be at the crosswalk shortly.
We ride along with Detective Chapko and observe as undercover officers meet with 2 women they believe could be trafficking victims.
Passenger door is closed and they are going to be heading westbound.
What's different here than in past years? The intent. They are not out to prosecute, but to protect, trying to understand how and why these women are being sexually exploited.
It's the misconception that a lot of people have is that, you know, they want to be out there, but they truly don't want to be out there.
They don't have a choice.
They don't have a choice.
Law enforcement officials acknowledge a history of bias and racism that prevented police on the streets from truly understanding how and why Indigenous girls were vulnerable and at risk.
There is bias in the police service. We recognize that there's implicit bias. We certainly have taken steps to try to address that. We have a team that's dedicated just to outreach, just to being out there and trying to get to know who's out on the street, trying to establish a relationship with them.
Lots of kits for tonight. Hopefully it'll be a busy night.
To do that, they've teamed with community workers like Debbie. As a trafficking victim herself, she explains outreach is neither quick nor simple.
We're controlled by, our traffickers. A lot of people call them their boyfriends or drug dealers, and you owe money and you have a choice. You get beaten or killed, or you go out and work.
We'll get started. I think we have about 68 kids that are missing this morning.
The new approach on the streets of Winnipeg is supported by the government. Jennifer Richardson runs Tresia's Trust, Manitoba's strategy to combat sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of children.
Copy, standby.
Crucially, the provincial government has committed more than 10 million Canadian dollars a year to fund it, a huge sum for a population of only about 1 million people. This groundbreaking endeavor focuses on prevention, intervention, and legislation, while trying to tackle the issue of why Indigenous people, a small minority of the population, represent more than 3/4 of all human trafficking victims in Manitoba. Both independent and government studies have detailed poverty, addiction, family violence, and sexual abuse as key factors.
When you look at the context of their environment and what is going on in the sex trade, the level of violence, the level of drugs, it's almost like mental terrorism. The kids are just acting out what they're engaged in.
And they've been terrorized.
Right.
Back with Detective Chapko, we learned the 2 young women they've approached are Indigenous. Police will now follow up with social agencies.
Okay, copy that.
And that's what's different and revolutionary about the approach here in Manitoba. A first in Canada, it uses targeted funds, but also words, deeds, and training to help fight human trafficking in a whole new way.
Okay, be safe.
That prioritizes the needs of victims. Victims like Lauren Chopek, although she's no longer a victim. Today, she is a survivor, thanks to the support and rehabilitation she received at a safe house called Hands of Mother Earth, or Home. For months, this rural healing lodge sheltered Lauren and cradled her with the love and protection she so needed.
It's really important because if I didn't come here, I probably would have died or something. I remember waking up some mornings like just really thankful that I'm not in a crappy, unsafe place in the city somewhere, but I can like look outside and hear all the birds and just peaceful.
Just 14 when she arrived, Lauren had already survived a lifetime of pain. As an emotionally troubled child, Lauren would at times run away from home. Eventually, she fell victim to sexual exploitation and trafficking on the streets of Winnipeg. The breaking point came when Lauren went missing for 9 days, lured to a hotel by an older man.
I'm pretty sure I was telling him I was like 20. People used to believe me when I would say I was 20 years old. Now, when I think about that, I was only 14. I looked like a freaking child.
It's only now, 5 years later, that she realizes how vulnerable she was.
When you experience sexual abuse, it's really confusing. You never know if it's your fault or is it theirs.
Lauren blamed herself, and that made healing that much more difficult.
Like before I moved here, I used to blame myself. And even during the time I was living here, I used to blame myself for everything. I would say, I let them do that to me. I'm dirty. It's my fault.
But here at the Healing Lodge, Lauren says she truly came to understand that she was a victim. Home helped her connect with her Indigenous culture and promoted a spiritual path to healing that no one had ever shown her before.
When you look at yourself and all you see is bad, and someone else will look at you and all they'll see is good. This was like my safe place. These staff were like my family.
Diane Redsky is the executive director of Mamaway, the charity that conceived of and runs Home. She says the fact that Indigenous youth comprise the majority of sex trafficking victims in Manitoba means rehabilitation programs need a special cultural and spiritual focus.
The Indigenous community is really rising up and has been the leaders in the forefront on the healing that needs to happen, on looking at the prevention pieces and supporting victims. And there's a very unique way to support victims. It's not to criminalize them anymore or to victimize them any more than they already have been. It really is, as we say, loving them back to health.
As Lauren shares her story, she clings to a large feather, a symbol of strength in Indigenous culture, and a sign that she speaks the truth. She also has embraced a traditional Indigenous spirit name. She is Striking Eagle, and she says she is starting to believe in what her name stands for, a person who will leave a mark on this earth. With every stroke of the drum, Tanae Little finds resounding strength. Flashbacks to her past painful life fade ever faster, and the soothing beat of the instrument reminds her she's safe.
And while you're drumming your spirit, like you feel safe, you feel connected.
Tanae learned how to drum during the time she spent here at Little Sisters, a transition home in Winnipeg for young sex trafficking victims. Today, she too is a survivor.
I love this place. I love being here, knowing that this place helps women change.
Tanae calls it change, but it was nothing short of salvation.
How old were you when you were
11.
You were 11.
Yeah.
Already introduced to drugs.
Yeah.
What kind of drugs?
Crack cocaine.
At 11.
At 11.
Tanae takes me to the streets where it began.
I always get anxiety coming back.
An older girl, someone who pretended to be her friend, was actually preying on Tanae, luring her with drugs and trafficking her for sex.
I remember one time that she put me in a room
and then 2 guys, one not together, but one would come in, and then I would have sex with him, and then the other guy would come in, and then I'd get high after that.
What would happen if you refused to have sex with anybody?
If you're not beat up, then you would get raped by a few of them at once.
There is a debt bondage that between $1,000 and $2,000 a day that these girls must hand in to their trafficker or else.
Diane Red Sky cannot help but feel anger. At Mama Way, she advocates for Indigenous women and children, specifically sex trafficking victims. She says the history of racism against this population feeds into the cycle of violence and exploitation against them.
It's really difficult to be able to fight those stereotypes as Indigenous women when a whole society is targeting Indigenous women and girls, particularly for violence and abuse, and that spills over into sex trafficking.
Good evening. It's an evening, everyone, and thanks for coming to the circle. We're going to start with a smudge. I'm very honored to be sitting in circle with you today, and thank you for inviting me.
Very honored to sit here with my survivor sisters today.
I'm glad that it's being brought to attention because it's been hidden for far too long.
You did an amazing thing to open your hearts.
Elder May Louise Campbell leads a traditional sharing circle.
Thank you to each and every one of you.
It's a spiritual connection with Indigenous culture and a unique path to healing for victims who say they have never felt worthy.
They don't feel sacred, they feel worthless.
Yeah, that's right. The only way that they're going to feel whole again is to reconnect to their traditional ways, through the ceremonies, through coming back to listening to the elders, coming back to believe they are not all that has happened to them. They are not that. They are sacred.
You need to know your worth and your strength, for sure, to get through it.
Tanae says that connecting with her native culture has empowered her to heal and also to understand how and why, as an Indigenous child in Canada, she was both vulnerable and exposed. More than half of all women and girls trafficked for sex in Canada are Indigenous, yet Indigenous people make up just 4% of the population. Poverty, abuse, addiction all play a role, but who are the people preying on them?
There's no set profile.
Danny Smythe is Winnipeg's deputy police chief.
We see young people exploiting young people. We see older people exploiting young people. We see white people exploiting Indigenous people. And we've certainly seen Indigenous people exploiting Indigenous. So there's no one set profile for that.
What the perpetrators have in common is a sense of impunity. History here tells them they are unlikely to get caught.
I think a lot of people who are already involved in crime have figured out that this is a much safer way to make money.
What was that address again?
Jennifer Richardson is working to change that.
Copy, standby.
Together with law enforcement, they are using laws already on the books to gather evidence against those interfering with the government mandate to protect children.
And so we started utilizing that piece of legislation because we don't need the children's testimony, which is much different from other types of legislation in this area.
Because victims are sometimes too fearful to testify, convictions for human trafficking have been few in Canada. Although the law on trafficking provides for tougher sentences, the burden of proof rests with the prosecution to obtain victim testimony and prove they feared for their safety.
There's no question that this is a very difficult area to prosecute for a whole number of reasons.
Jennifer Mann is a Manitoba Crown prosecutor who has been working these kinds of cases for years. This year, she successfully prosecuted 46-year-old Darrow Ackman, sentenced to 15 years for living off the avails of prostitution, making child pornography, and sexual assault. 7 victims came forward, 5 of them children. 2 committed suicide before a verdict was ever reached.
All of the victims were ripe to be taken advantage of, And this accused did this with gusto. So you have the judge's very strong comments about the conduct and the vulnerability of the children involved in this case.
Mann says she simply did not have the evidence to prosecute for human trafficking. Still, she points out it's a strong verdict with a long sentence. Here in Manitoba, more arrests, prosecutions, and convictions are working in tandem with outreach, prevention, and rehabilitation.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm good.
You need a kid?
Looking good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I need some water.
Of course.
So that the trafficking of Indigenous women and girls is no longer perceived as a crime without punishment. The journey alone transports the mind. A prop plane traveling to northern Manitoba takes us into the spiritual heartland of most Indigenous communities here. But the beauty belies a saga of isolation, poverty, and discrimination. We land in Norway House Cree Nation, like many Indigenous communities, fiercely proud of its cultural inheritance, but undeniably scarred by decades of vulnerability and abuse. We witness a first here, an Indigenous community that says it's confronting the issue of child exploitation after decades of denial by bringing an anti-trafficking education program right into its schools.
We're here to do a presentation with you today on sexual exploitation.
Samantha Folster and Gilbert Fredette are a determined team.
The first step in rebuilding our community is to say enough is enough.
Both community leaders trained by the Manitoba government to create a curriculum-based program where kids hear how and why child exploitation has traumatized their communities.
I don't think it's ever been talked about that way. It's more like, let's not talk about it. Let's just leave it. Let's leave it under the rug and let it stay there. And it's the fear of speaking about it and the shame that comes with it and the guilt of feeling that maybe this was my fault.
It's the right time now to open the doors and get those skeletons out of the closet and start talking about these issues within our own community. Because if we don't do that, then we're not going to be part of the solution. We're going to continue to be part of the problem.
The solution, they say, must begin in the classroom as a first step towards prevention. Kids get a detailed account of how they might be lured and candid reasons for why they may be vulnerable as Indigenous youth. School counselor Jem York says the frankness of the discussions is what makes them meaningful and effective.
I think putting the words to it and naming it and saying, this is what this is called, this is sexual exploitation, this is human trafficking, and this is what happens. And I think the kids are like, oh, okay. That's what that is, you know.
The difference now is we're talking about it. I mean, you know, we have plans in place in the community which we never had before.
Ron Evans is the chief here at Norway House. He says a legacy of addiction, violence, and abuse means many children are not living with their families, but are instead in government care.
So how does it compromise communities like this one?
Well, we have an issue with our children. We have a high number of children in care. It makes our communities very vulnerable that way for predators to take advantage of our children.
Changing that will take years of community involvement. At a local fish fry, families get together, share a laugh and a song. All of it helps with instilling optimism here, a belief that things can and will change for the children of Norway House.
We need to let them know that it's wrong. Let them know that it's not their fault, you know, not to feel shame, because it's not their fault. You know, how is it that we can heal as a community?
To heal, Folster stresses the importance of culture and heritage. She says recent generations of Indigenous people are unfamiliar with their native traditions, the result of decades of government-sponsored assimilation through residential schools. We visit with Folster at her home as she participates in a smudging ceremony, a sacred ritual that uses smoke from sage and other herbs believed to cleanse and purify the body and soul. Sitting on a large wooden deck in Folster's backyard with the sun setting behind them, the women pray for healing. Reconnecting with those roots, Folster says, is key to ending a seemingly never-ending cycle of abuse.
I just want wellness in our community. It's called Minoyawin, wellness. It was important, and that was my goal, and it'll continue to be my goal, and that's why I sit here today and do the awareness on sexual exploitation.
There is tentative optimism here now that with slow but steady education and awareness, places like Norway House will be a strong refuge for Indigenous youth, restoring it as the heartland it once was for its elders.